Templin and I am a student teacher at Harrison Elementary, and I decided to do my senior project over a math standard, identifying dimes and pennies. Some things to think about as we step foot into Harrison Elementary is it is located in Warsaw, Indiana, and Warsaw, Indiana has a population of around 14,000 people. Within that 14,000 people, there are 514 students that attend Harrison Elementary. Again, 48.4% obtain free lunches within that student enrollment, and 7.6% obtain reduced lunches. Within that student enrollment, there are 187 students that are English language learners, and this is a high percentage compared to all the other 8 elementary schools in Warsaw District. So I do want to consider that as I teach my lessons over my unit. Some classroom factors I need to think about. I do have 18 students. There are 8 girls and 10 boys. There are 4 English language learners who have a WIDA scale of 1 to 2 because they are developing their English language. This is expected to have a lower WIDA level. I have 4 students with an IEP. My 1 student has an IEP for behavior and autism. The other 3 have an IEP, an individual education plan for speech and language. So I need to think about when their needs are getting met and how I'm going to meet their special needs during my unit. Technology within the classroom, I do have an interactive memo board that is slightly used throughout the unit, and to have a one-to-one iPad for each student, so each student has their own device, and this is easy to implement throughout my unit. Some things to think about as I'm teaching my unit, I do need to think about learning preferences. Each student was given a survey right here that I gave to them at the beginning of student teaching, and it asked them just basic things on what they like to learn and how they like to learn. This resulted in knowing that I have 8 kinesthetic learners, 3 auditory, and the rest are visual, but they all claim that they learn best with all 3 preferences. So making sure these learners are met in their needs is very crucial. Knowing that I have 4 English language learners, I need to implement visuals like anchor charts. I need to make sure I have manipulatives like coins and dimes, and making sure that dimes and pennies are both showed throughout, and making sure money in 3 forms, paper, fake, and real money, are all presented throughout the unit. Now, I do have some lower economic students who do come from a lower status, so making sure that I'm not pressuring them to bringing in supplies or expecting too much out of them when I should be providing most of the material myself. And then my student needs, I did mention previously in the presentation that I have 4 students with an IEP, and making sure those students are met and instructing them when they're not getting pulled out for their IEP. Now going on to my assessment plan, throughout this unit, identifying dimes and pennies, I did have 3 learning goals that I highlighted. Learning goal number 1 is differentiating the characteristics of a dime and penny. That's simply knowing that a dime and penny shape, color, the face and the front and backs of the pennies and the dimes. And then learning goal 2 is just knowing the value of a dime and penny. A dime is worth 10 cents and a penny is worth 1 cent. So you can take those to an actual store and buy stuff with them, making it a reality for students. And then concluding my learning goals, I have learning goal number 3, and this is understanding that a 10 ones is a group of ones, and that 10 pennies equals 1 dime. Now, knowing this, you use a 10 frame as a manipulative, and 10 pennies equals 1 dime, they can see that within the 10 frame. Now, going on and how I would assess learning goal number 1, up here in the corner you see I have my pre and post. I designed my pre and post assessment identically so I can track and monitor growth effectively and make it sure that my data is correct from the beginning to the end. Now, I do have questions 1, 2, and 3, and they're simply just coloring the coins the color correctly. So they're going to color dimes with a pencil color or a gray crayon, and they're going to color the pennies with a brown crayon. Now, on the verbal piece, I did introduce my literature standard, and I have the students come back to the table, and I have a penny and a dime right on the back of the table to show them the actual coin. I ask them the 2 questions. What is the coin and how do they know? They have to provide 2 or 3 reasons, because within the standard it asks to provide reasons for their knowledge of understanding. So that is my pre and post, and then I go ahead and I work on my formative assessment. The students really enjoyed working on this formative assessment because it has the fronts and backs, and they're able to cut out the coins of each penny and dime. They were able to collaborate with their group members, so this was fun. First graders love to talk amongst themselves, and so they cut out these coins, the fronts and backs, and they put them under the pennies and dimes, which I showed them in guided practice setting. Going on to learning goal number 2, up here again we have our pre and post assessment, and there's a little bit of repetition within my learning goal 1 and learning goal number 2. For question 1, 2, and 3, I mentioned prior that I would be having the students color the coins correctly for learning goal 1. But for learning goal 2, I just asked them to tell me the value of the given coins. Now, within the value of the given coins, question 1 and 2 are simply just pennies and dimes. And on question 3, it's a multiple coin collection. And then again, going back to the verbal piece, the same setting I'd be asking them how much is this coin worth? I'd be referring to the coins, the dimes and pennies, and I'd ask them, what are these coins worth? Another formative assessment I effectively used was having this worksheet, and it has dimes first. As we count some coins, we want to make sure that we always count our dimes first. Segueing right out of the place value, they understand that they always count their tower of tens first because it's worth more, and then they count their itty bitty baby ones. So counting dimes first, I made an easy way to segue into counting money. So this was a really fun way, and they colored each coin and told me the value of the collection. Learning goal number 3. This is my pre and post, and it's worth just 2 questions. So I want to make sure that they're accurately answering them to get mastery level. So question 6 and 7 represents 10 frames, and they pull in their pennies. And I have 3 10 frames up on this problem 6 and 4 10 frames on problem 7. They're simply going to associate the 10 frame full of pennies with 1 dime. They'll just tell me how many dimes are represented within the 10 frame. And something we do in 1st grade in Mrs. Templin's class is we do a whiteboard talk. So I have all the students come down to the carpet, they do their whiteboards, and I ask and challenge them with questions, and they simply write out their answer. And we had magnetic 10 frames that I put on the whiteboard, and they were able to tell me how many dimes were represented in the 10 frame. They loved that formative assessment. Some design for instruction. As I was designing this, I fell in love with 3 activities, and the first one was on day 1 of the unit. I had them create a T-chart as a whole class. I gave half the class dimes and half the class pennies, and I asked them to meet with someone that they would have the opposite coin with. So once they observed that, the dimes and pennies, we wrote down all the characteristics we found. We thought about the color, we thought about the shape, we thought if the edges were rough and smooth. They really went into great detail about these characteristics. Now, moving on to activity number 2, highlighting learning goal number 2 as well. They had some sorting mats, and I printed off each a dime and penny. You can see right here. Those sorting mats were each, they had their own, which was nice for students because they felt responsible for those sorting mats. And 3 rules that we have in counting coins is that we always sort the coins first, we always count the dimes first because they're worth more, and then we always count the pennies last. So that was a very easy and effective way to show them those 3 steps, and they followed them very closely. My last activity that I want to highlight during this unit is my coin bubble on Greg Tang Math. When Mrs. Hag and I were co-teaching, we always would bring Greg Tang Math in, so they were familiar with this and comfortable with using the app. Excuse me. And right here, you can see our little app that we would use, and it's called Coin Bubble, and it would pop up a value, and it would say 8 cents, and the students would have to go on the game, and they'd have to put in 8 cents on the 10 frame to show that value. As I mentioned before, we used Greg Tang Math, and this is just one way we mentioned and implemented technology. We used more games than just Coin Bubble, but Coin Bubble definitely was the most prominently used, and because it had a variety, and it would level them up to a more challenging value of cents that they would have to find within the 10 frame. Another thing that we had is the Apps Math Learning Center, and this is a website, so it was more difficult to implement because I had to go in and put in all the URLs for the 1st graders because that can be challenging at times. But it was a visual representative of the 10 frames, and instead of bringing down their whiteboards to the carpet, they brought their iPads, and it's always a privilege to work on their iPads in Mrs. Templin's class, so they love working with technology. So this was available to all students, and we drew our 10 frames, we dragged our pennies, and 10 pennies equals 1 dime. And going back, the author, Kitty Rutherford, author of the article, Why Play Math Games, states, playing games encourages strategic math thinking of students. They find different strategies for solving problems and deepening their understanding of numbers. So that's always a good way to implement math games because it helps them think strategically. Moving on to my instructional decision making, there were ways in my unit that I had to change and adjust my instruction based on what the students' responses were. And so one of those happened on day one within 5 minutes of my first lesson. As I mentioned before, I had half the class get dimes and half the class get pennies, and then they met up and conversed with their other partner about what was different between their dime and what was different between their pennies. And as students were getting together, I had 2 English language learners come together, and they thought, and they were talking and interchangeably using the terms dimes and diamonds, they were using them as the same. They didn't quite understand that a diamond was different than a diamond. They were just associating the 2 sounds, die at the beginning, that they just meant both the same terms. And I observed that this was a minimal pair observation. A minimal pair observation refers to sounds that confuse or replace for each other, diamond and dime. Shoshana Hernandez mentioned this as the director of the Institute for TESOL Studies. So just thinking that they heard die, they may be more familiar with diamond rather than dime. So they were using these interchangeably. And one way I helped fix this issue within our lesson is I thought I lacked in defining each term. Students were not understanding that coins referred to as pennies and dimes. They were confused if both of those could be referred to as a coin. And they also were confused with the plural form of dime and dimes, or penny and pennies. So understanding that pennies is just meaning more than one penny. And so in result of this, I made an anchor chart with definitions and terms with dime, diamonds, and showed them visuals with captions, especially my 4 English language learners. And this resulted in the ELs knowing, the 2 EL students knowing and defining dimes and diamonds, and then they didn't use them interchangeably after this lesson. Another way I decided to change my instruction was learning goal number 2. And I knew that when they count a collection of coins, they always see the dimes first, and I mentioned that previously already. And when I had given them the work, that formative assessment that had dimes first, they had resulted in a formative assessment that was 75%. And I knew 75% was expected when only learning it one day, but also I knew that I could expect more out of them, and that giving them a challenge would really prompt them to do more and exceed. So I did. My first graders love a challenge and they love motivation. So I prompted them with this question. What if dimes in the collection of coins were not always displayed first? So they've only seen collections of coins when given dimes first. And I thought it would be really cool and fun if every time they would see a coin change, they would clap. To A, wake up their brain and have fun with it, and B, to understand, oh, I need to start counting differently. So if our dimes were first, they would count 10, 20, clap, and then moving on to their pennies, which would be 21, 22, and 23. Continuing on within the collection. Students loved this coin change, but they also exceeded very well on their formative assessment after this implementation of instruction, and they did get a 97%, which is exactly what I was expecting, and they did extremely well in this formative. Some analysis of student learning. There is a whole group graph up here, and it does show that the whole group pre-test, students did reach an average of 17.87%, which is pretty low, but you also have to think that this was nothing that they learned in kindergarten, but they also knew that they had to learn dimes and pennies before quarter 3. The standard does consist of quarters and nickels, but I deconstructed the standard and made sure to only focus on dimes and pennies because we just segued out of place value. So after that 17.87% as an average, at the post-test, they did increase their score by 65.28%, which is an abundant amount, and I'm super proud of them, and they all reached, as a whole group, mastery of more than 78%. Going down here, I have each student labeled as a letter, and they decided we have pre-test and post-test. As you can see on the graph, not one student met mastery on the pre-test, and again, that's expected because this is a brand new skill. But one thing I do want to highlight is that on our post-test, when students took it, I have only 3 learners, student E, L, and N, did not reach mastery on the post-test. Every other child did, and I do want to mention 2 out of those 3 learners are EL. So maybe that was a manipulative use or they misunderstood something, but I believe that those 2 students, because of their EL, maybe lacked some comprehension. Analysis of student learning subgroups, I chose non-EL versus EL, and I wanted to track their data to see what subgroups might have done a little better than others and why. So on our pre-test, I saw, surprisingly, that our ELs did incredibly higher than our non-EL group, and this surprised me. But I do know that research does show that ELs do effectively better when given manipulatives, anchor charts, and visuals. So on the pre-test, there was coins given. They could see them during the verbal piece of the assessment. So I believe maybe they did do a lot better than the non-EL group because of those manipulative uses. But then you see on the post-test, my non-EL group did rise past mastery level more than 85%, and our non-EL group did slightly below that, around a 75% average for our EL group. So both of them did grow, and I'm very impressed with that data. So I did track 3 individuals as well, my at readiness, below readiness, and above readiness learners. Student D is the above readiness, student K is at readiness, and student P is below readiness learner. You can see all 3, we have learning goal 1, 2, and 3, all 3 of these learners did incredibly well on learning goal 1 and 2, but then you can tell on learning goal 3, student D did very well, he still grew, but student K and P still lacked on learning goal 3, and I'll explain a little more about that in a minute. As I reflect and self-evaluate, I think about learning goal number 1, and I think the most successful activity that I taught was the coin, sort, cut, and paste page. I mentioned it previously in the presentation, but I think it was most successful because it was the first day of the unit. Students were really eager and excited about learning money. They haven't learned money yet, so it was a brand new skill, and it was just really motivating and engaging for them as learners. So they collaborated with their group tables and they cut out coins. It was really a good, fun activity for them, and only one student mixed the coin and the dimes and pennies, but everyone else did very well. The least successful for learning goal number 1 was the penny and dime maze. This was as an anchor activity for after the coin sort page, and students were confusing the fronts and backs, so they only were recognizing the faces of a dime and penny. They only knew that Franklin D. Roosevelt was on the dime and Abraham Lincoln was on the penny. They didn't understand that the Lincoln Memorial Building was on the back or the torch was on the back of the dime. So this was a little confusing. Most mazes were unfinished because they didn't understand that they had to find the backs of both dimes and pennies, but my higher ability students did achieve this very well. Now, going on to learning goal number 2, the most successful was the graphic organizer over learning goal number 1 and learning goal number 2. This graphic organizer actually embodies all 3 learning goals, which I found very interesting and informative. And students did this during a guided group setting. So they partnered up and they had to tell me the cent, the value of the cent, the color of the pennies, and color the amount, also with the dime. They loved that. It was coloring. First graders love to color and add color to their pictures. So that was very good, and all students achieved it. Now, my least successful learning goal, number 2, was the counting the coins. The students, again, like I said, their formative assessment was 75%, which was not mastery, but on day 2, they did reach mastery, which I was happy with. So again, because it was day 1, it was my least successful for learning goal number 2, but again, day 2, they did reach a successful amount for that activity. Lastly, my learning goal number 3, the most successful, was the whiteboard 10-frame formative assessment mentioned earlier, and they loved being able to draw out their 10 frames and mock the teacher. I had them do exactly what I did, so they were the teacher to one of their partners. They loved doing that role, and so they had to fill in their pennies and draw, and it was really a neat way to see them. I saw a lot of students with their artistic abilities, and that really exploded in this activity. And all students were engaged. I didn't have much distractions. It was just a really good, fluent activity. Now, least successful would have to have been the 10 frames dime worksheet I created. Now, this worksheet was the last thing they'd be doing before the post-assessment, and I wanted to make sure it looked somewhat like the formative, or the summative, so I went ahead and I worded things just like it, and they just lacked confidence. So things I would change is on learning goal number 3, there was a snow day. So I made sure to have an additional instructional day and add strategies within that. I only had 1 or 2 strategies to implement through this learning goal number 1. So I would add more strategies in another additional day. Pre and post assessment, I would go ahead and add a baggie of coins that they could use during the pre-assessment. I did not do this the first round, and so they weren't able to use the baggie of coins during the post-assessment, and that's one way I would change it. Thank you for listening to my presentation on Molly Templin. Are there any questions?